My name's Andrea Millward-Hargrave, and I'm a member of the Conference Planning Committee. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Chris Taylor of Plum Consulting in the UK to discuss briefly their report on enabling a sustainable digital future. Chris, I'd like you to start, please, by outlining the premise of this work.
Sure, thanks, Andrea, and hello to everyone. I'm delighted to join you. So this work is based on some research we did in 2023 and we published at the start of this year, which was themed around three main areas. One was environmental concerns and the impact of digital technology on the environment. The second was digital rights and digital ethics. And the third was digital inclusion. I'm not going to get through all of that in the short time we have this afternoon. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about our research, but then narrow into some of the key points I wanted to bring out, which are mainly around the digital rights and digital ethics area. So as I said, we published this research earlier this year in January on these three themes. And importantly, I think where we felt we'd made a new contribution to thinking is that we identified overlaps and intersections between the three themes, and we explored them in our research and report. If you want to see the detail of that, please do read our report. It's freely available on our website. Some of those overlaps you can see identified in this Venn diagram. So, for example, there are fairly obvious overlaps between environmental sustainability and digital inclusion. And there's a paradox there because, as we know, the more you build networks, the more natural resources you consume, and that tends to be bad for the environment. But on the other hand, you also are offsetting the cost of things like travel because people can work online better. So that's a simple example of what we found. I won't go into any more detail than that. For this short session, as I said, I'm going to focus on digital rights, which was one of the central themes of our work. And this also brings in the important concept of digital ethics, which was also a topic we looked at in the study. As you'll see, in doing this work, we also touch on the other key themes, environmental sustainability and digital inclusion. But digital rights is our focus for this few minutes we have together today. What's interesting and probably important context is to understand exactly what we mean by digital rights. And I haven't put it on the slide, but I got this definition from the World Economic Forum website, and I think it's instructive, and I'm going to read it out. On that website, the definition of digital rights is: digital rights are basically human rights in the internet era. The rights to online privacy and freedom of expression, for example, are really extensions of the equal and inalienable rights laid out in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I like that because it explains that human rights is not a new concept, as we all know. Application of human rights online is relatively new, but what I think that definition tells you is a lot of the key concepts are the same. And there's important work being done on digital rights in the European Declaration on Digital Rights and Principles in the European Union. And on this slide here, we've just captured some features identified by the European Council in their work on digital rights. So the right to access the internet without discrimination, the right to freedom of expression, including the duty of public authorities to protect it, freedom of assembly, association and participation through use of the internet, rights to privacy and data protection, rights to online access to education, and the right to special protection and guidance. So a lot of those concepts, I don't want to overstress this point, are human rights that we're used to in other contexts, but we need increasingly to think of them in the online context because, of course, more and more of our lives are spent transacting online. Now, Andrea asked me to do a couple of case studies, so I'm gonna include these here. The first one is fairly simple, comes from our research, and it shows that ethical behavior drives trust and digital engagement. So to take a step back from this, I think what we understand, and is fairly uncontroversial, is to say that digital connectivity, online engagement, and the ability to engage with the online environment by having good digital skills will deliver benefits to individuals and more broadly to society. However, on the other hand, if there are gaps in connectivity or engagement, or people aren't skilled enough and they can't get online, then that will give us disadvantages. So to take an example, remote 24/7 access to education and health services online, those are good for each of us individually, and they help make society more healthy and educated. So being online is good for us as individuals, and it's good for broader society, and being offline has the opposite effect. And that's why policymakers are so worried about what we call the digital divide. Now, we've done research, and we're not unique in this, which shows that respect for our digital rights through ethical behavior online builds trust, which overcomes one of the obstacles to digital engagement, and hence that boosts adoption. So to put that another way, if the internet is a trustworthy place, more of us will feel comfortable to engage in line, and we will unlock some of those benefits I've described. If there's unethical behavior and lack of trust, people will stop using the digital economy and stop going online, and therefore those benefits will be reduced or removed. So that's an important reason why ethics and trust are important in the digital environment. The second case study I want to look at is a little narrower, and it links to the work we've done on environmental protection as well. So we're looking here at the impact of misinformation about climate change, and here are some fairly simple examples of media coverage identifying how data or information are misrepresented and how that can be a problem in broader efforts to understand climate change and to mitigate damage done from climate change. So we know that misinformation, fake news, as it's often called, about climate change can lead to bad outcomes, diluting important information about the climate crisis and or casting doubt on calls for action. So finally, I've been asked to say a little bit about, so what can we do to mitigate these risks and to improve things? Well, there's quite a lot happening here already. Again, I'm going to take a step back here because I remember in the early part of this century, we thought about these things differently. And I think the internet was regarded simultaneously by different stakeholders as both a sort of information utopia, which regulators should keep their hands off and stay well away from, or on the other hand, the Wild West and a highly dangerous place. So there was this quite polarized view of the internet, a view that regulators should not go near it, and another view which was actually it's quite a dangerous space and there's information on there which hasn't been validated. It can be an unsafe space, particularly for some types of vulnerable users. But now, because so much of our lives is lived online, policymakers are realizing that ethical standards, rules and protections are needed to ensure people aren't harmed online, just as we have equivalent arrangements to ensure people are not harmed offline. Here are some developments. Our research shows, and I think this is accepted actually, that in Europe there has been very significant progress in putting legislation in to protect users online from all kinds of harm, be it misinformation or younger people being exposed to unacceptable content, other types of digital harm. And so the EU and the UK, actually, now that we're outside of the EU, we have in place legislation to protect people online. I think the proof as to how effective that legislation is going to be and how effective the regulators are going to be in enforcing it and preventing bad outcomes is still out there. So we don't know. I think the proof of the outcomes is still up to be seen, but the legislation is in place and that establishes a framework within which consumers can be protected. We're a bit more used to general data protection regulation that's been in place for some time. So national legislation is important and is happening. International collaboration is really important here because unlike the markets which regulators are sometimes accustomed to governing, data crosses borders, and digital markets are global, digital platforms are global, and so national regulation on its own doesn't always do the job. So international organisations have a role to share information and best practice, particularly between jurisdictions with more developed rules and those who are trying to learn about it. And of course, you have international frameworks which apply across more than one nation, and the European framework within the European Union is a good example of that. Thirdly, I wanted to mention digital and online platforms, because as well as being increasingly regulated, they have their own policies which they apply to try and protect their users. I know this is quite a controversial area and one which is often the subject of public debate, whether those online platforms are doing enough and whether there's therefore the need for more regulation. But that is definitely an area which is relevant to the discussion we're having. And finally, public information and advocacy. So there's a mix here. Governments and regulators don't always introduce formal rules. Sometimes they provide information to help people. And there are examples of that. For example, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency in the USA has an awareness program about cybersecurity, which is designed to protect ordinary citizens. And we have charities and third sector organisations in the UK. One that I know very well through my work is the Good Things Foundation, which provides advice and help online. And that's an example of a third sector initiative. So because our time is short, I'm going to stop there and hand back to Andrea.
Thank you very much indeed, Chris. And I love the idea of the information utopia versus the Wild West, particularly in the regulatory field. You've touched on, with this last slide in particular, something that's of course very important to this group. The conference is organised by the UNESCO IFAP Working Group on Information Accessibility. And it's not only connectivity that we talk about and that you're talking about here, and the impact of connectivity in a broader sense in terms of the environment, but also the quality of information that's so important to our economies, societies, and our cultural environments. And you emphasize there right at the end the global importance of what we're talking about, that there is no, not necessarily any barrier to the way transmitted. So I'd like to thank you very much, Chris, and please do point the audience to your report. Thank you very much indeed.
Very much, Andrea. So I've referenced quite a lot of data and information just in that short presentation, but two Plum reports. One is the one that was the center of this research. That's enabling a sustainable digital future, and that picks up the ideas about digital rights and digital inclusion. But we also did a study, an insight piece, which you can see a screenshot on the right there. That was about trust in the internet, trust in digital services, and the way in which trust is a constraining factor in take-up. So I tried to reference it earlier in my presentation when I said, if there's unethical behavior, that damages trust, that prevents people going online, that reduces the benefits that flow to individuals. So you can find both of those reports on our website. Thank you very much.
Thank you.